My name is Claire, and for 20 years, I was an ER nurse, someone who saw life and death every single day. I thought I understood it all: the fragile line we walk, the chaos of the world, and the randomness of fate. But I was wrong. The night I died in that storm, everything I believed about life, God, and the soul was shattered. I crossed into a place so beautiful and terrifying that it changed me forever. And what I saw there, what I felt, was more real than anything in this world. It's the reason I'm here, alive, and sharing this with you now. It was a night like any other, or so I thought. I was finishing my shift at the hospital, exhausted to my bones and numb to the chaos that had unfolded during my 12 hours on duty. Another car accident victim brought in too late, another family crushed under the weight of unexpected loss. My job was to stay steady, to patch up the broken and keep moving, but the truth is, I hadn't felt steady in years. Not since the day I lost my own little girl. The rain was coming down hard as I left the hospital, fat droplets pelting the windshield of my car as I turned onto the dark, winding road that led home. The storm was growing fiercer by the second, lightning flashing across the sky like a divine warning. I didn't think much of it at the time. Storms came and went, just like everything else in life. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my mind wandering to the argument I'd had with my sister earlier that week. Amanda had always been the spiritual one, but her constant talk about faith and forgiveness grated on me. How could someone believe in a loving God when life was so full of pain? I had stopped praying years ago. It felt pointless to speak into a void that never answered back. The tires slipped slightly as I rounded a curve, and I slowed down, squinting through the rain to see the road ahead. That's when I saw the headlights, two blinding white beams barreling toward me in my lane. My heart lurched as I yanked the wheel to the right, the car skidding wildly. I heard the deafening crunch of metal and felt the world turn upside down before everything went black. When I came to, I wasn't in my car, at least not in any way that made sense. I was floating, weightless, unmoored, and completely free of the searing pain I should have felt from the crash. The space around me was endless, a vast expanse of soft, golden light that seemed to pulse with something alive, something I couldn't name. For the first time in years, I felt peace, a deep, all-encompassing peace that wrapped around me like a warm embrace. But then, as quickly as it came, the peace was interrupted by a presence. It wasn't a person exactly, but it wasn't formless either. A figure emerged from the light, radiating an energy so pure and powerful that I instinctively recoiled. The figure didn't speak, not in words, but I understood them all the same. "You are not finished," they said, their voice ringing like a bell in my mind. "Your soul is fractured, Claire. You must face what you have buried." Fractured? I didn't understand. I wanted to ask what they meant, but before I could, scenes from my life began to appear around me. They weren't just memories, they were living, breathing moments that enveloped me completely. I was standing in the ER, watching myself turn away from a grieving mother. I heard my own voice, sharp and detached, telling her that her son hadn't made it. I had walked away without so much as a word of comfort, too burned out to care. The scene shifted, and now I was at home, years earlier, with my daughter, Lily. She was 5, her cheeks flushed with fever, as I sat by her bedside. I was praying then, pleading with God to save her. But he didn't. She died that night, and in my despair, I had closed myself off to everything and everyone, including him. The figure's voice echoed around me. "You blame yourself, but your anger at God has blinded you to the truth." I wanted to scream, to push these memories away, but there was no escape. Another moment unfolded. This time, I was with my sister. Amanda's face was filled with hurt as I dismissed her attempts to comfort me with scripture. God doesn't care. I had spat, my words dripping with venom. If he did, my daughter would still be alive. The figures stepped closer, their light growing brighter. "Every choice ripples outward, Claire. Every act of love, every act of neglect. You've seen the pain, but have you seen the grace?" I didn't know what they meant. Grace? What grace? All I could see was my own failure, Failure to save my patients, failure to comfort my family, failure to keep my faith. The light around me began to dim, and for the first time, I noticed shadows creeping at the edges of the void. They were cold and suffocating, whispering words I couldn't quite understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Accusation. Fear gripped me as the shadows grew closer, but the figure held up a hand, and they stopped. "This is the path you are on," the voice said, their tone tinged with sorrow. "But it is not too late. You must return." Return? To what? My voice cracked with desperation. "I don't know how to fix any of this. I've tried, but it's too late." "It is never too late to choose love, to choose faith," the figure replied. "Your soul is not lost, but you must take the steps to heal it. I will guide you, but the journey is yours to make." Before I could respond, the light around me intensified, blinding and all consuming. I felt myself being pulled backward, the peace and warmth fading as the cold, hard world slammed back into me. My eyes shot open, and I gasped for air, the sound of monitors and frantic voices filling my ears. I was in the hospital, alive, but I wasn't the same. The visions, the voice, the light, it was all still with me, burned into my mind like a brand. I had been given a chance, a second chance, and I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. I had seen the shadows waiting for me, and I knew I couldn't face them again. Whatever it took, I would find a way to mend what was broken. When I woke up in the hospital, I couldn't remember my name for a few seconds, let alone why I was there. The sterile white ceiling blurred into focus, and the beeping of the heart monitor echoed in my ears. Slowly, it all came rushing back. The rain, the headlights, the crash, and the other place. I felt a sharp pang in my chest, not from the accident, but from the overwhelming sense that I'd left something unfinished, something that demanded to be understood. My thoughts were racing, and yet I felt paralyzed, stuck in a body that ached with every breath. The doctor came in not long after I stirred. He explained that I'd been unconscious for several hours, but that the injuries were less severe than they could have been. A few fractured ribs, a concussion, and some deep bruising, but nothing life-threatening. "You're lucky," he said. I wanted to tell him it wasn't luck, that I'd seen something, been somewhere. But what could I say? That I'd met a glowing figure in an endless void? That I'd been shown pieces of my broken soul? The words felt absurd, even in my own head. So I just nodded, the weight of the experience pressing heavy against my chest. Amanda was the first to visit me. She stood at the doorway, arms crossed, her face a mixture of relief and apprehension. "You look like hell," she said, but her voice was soft, teasing. I managed a weak smile. That was Amanda, always finding humor in the darkest moments. She sat beside me and held my hand, her touch warm and grounding. "When I got the call, I prayed so hard," she said. "I begged God to save you." Her words struck me like a blow. Just days ago, I dismissed her prayers, called her naive for believing in a God who cared. And now here she was sitting by my side, her faith unshaken. I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. "Thanks," I mumbled, feeling the sting of shame rise in my throat. She tilted her head, studying me. "Something's different about you," she said. "What happened out there?" I hesitated. The memory of the light and the figure was still so vivid, but how could I explain it without sounding insane? "I don't know." I lied. "It's all a blur." Amanda didn't press me, but the way she looked at me made it clear she didn't believe me. I could feel her silent prayers hanging in the air as she sat with me, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel annoyed by them. I felt comforted. That night, I dreamt of the steward, the same radiant figure, standing in the same golden void, their voice as clear as before. "You are back, but the work has not yet begun," they said. Their presence was both soothing and unsettling, a reminder of the weight I now carried. "The fractures in your soul must be healed, Claire. You will see the moments where you turned away, and you must confront them." The dream ended abruptly, leaving me gasping awake in my hospital bed, my heart pounding. I stared at the ceiling, trying to steady my breathing. Their words repeated in my mind like a mantra. the moments where you turned away. Over the next few days, the memories began surfacing, moments I hadn't thought about in years, moments I'd buried so deep I convinced myself they didn't matter. It started with the faces. The grieving mother in the ER, the colleague I'd snapped at during a double shift, the homeless man I'd ignored on my way to work. Their faces appeared in flashes, unbidden, always accompanied by that same creeping sense of guilt. Each time, I told myself it wasn't my fault. I was only human. I couldn't save everyone. But the excuses felt hollow now, the weight of those choices heavier than ever. The first real test came 2 weeks after I was discharged. I'd been cleared to return to light duties at the hospital, but the moment I walked through those doors, a wave of nausea hit me. The fluorescent lights, the antiseptic smell, the hurried voices, it all felt suffocating. I made my way to the nurse's station, trying to keep my composure, but then I saw her. It was the grieving mother from my vision, the one I'd brushed off all those years ago. She was sitting in the waiting room, clutching a framed photo to her chest. Her face was older now, lined with pain, but I recognized her instantly. My legs froze. My breath caught in my throat. What were the chances? Was this coincidence, or was I being tested? Either way, I couldn't ignore her. I approached her slowly, my heart pounding with each step. "Excuse me," I said, my voice trembling. "Do you remember me?" She looked up, her eyes red and swollen, and for a moment, there was no recognition. Then her expression changed, and I saw a flicker of something, anger, maybe, or hurt. "You're that nurse," she said. "The one who," she trailed off, her voice thick with emotion. I nodded, feeling the shame rise in me again. "I'm so sorry," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "For how I treated you, for not being there when you needed someone." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out, tell me it was too late. But then her shoulders sagged, and she let out a long, shaky breath. "I've been carrying that day with me for so long," she said. I blamed myself. I thought maybe if I'd gotten him here sooner. Tears welled in my eyes as I shook my head. "It wasn't your fault, and it wasn't mine. Sometimes things happen that we can't control. But that doesn't mean we have to carry the pain alone." Her eyes softened, and she reached out to squeeze my hand. In that moment, I felt a tiny piece of the weight lift from my chest. It wasn't complete, it couldn't be, not yet, but it was a start. That night, I dreamed again. The steward appeared, their light brighter than before, their voice filled with something that felt like approval. "The first step is taken," they said, "but there is more to face." I woke with a renewed sense of purpose. If this was the path I needed to walk, I would walk it. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew I couldn't turn back now. Not with the shadows still lurking, waiting for me to falter. The days after I spoke to the grieving mother passed in a blur, but something had shifted in me. A crack in the wall I'd built around my heart had appeared, and the light from that other place seemed to seep through. Yet, with every step I took forward, I felt a dark presence trailing me. It wasn't tangible, but I could feel it, like a shadow that didn't belong to me, hovering just outside my line of sight. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew better. The steward's warning echoed in my mind. The shadows were real, and they were waiting for me to falter. One evening, I stayed late at the hospital, finishing paperwork for a patient who'd just been transferred to hospice care. It was quiet, the kind of eerie stillness that only a hospital at night can have. As I walked to my car in the dimly lit parking lot, I heard footsteps behind me. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Turning slowly, I saw nothing. The lot was empty except for the rows of parked cars. I laughed nervously at myself and kept walking, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. When I got home, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, my heart still racing. The house felt colder than usual, and the silence inside pressed against me like a weight. I went to the kitchen, flicking on lights as I moved through the house, but even the bright bulbs couldn't chase away the unease. As I poured myself a glass of water, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement in the hallway. My hand trembled, and the glass slipped from my grip, shattering on the floor. Get a hold of yourself, I whispered, crouching down to pick up the shards. But as I reached for them, I felt it again, that suffocating cold, the same one I'd felt in the void when the shadows crept closer. I straightened up, my pulse thundering in my ears. The hallway was empty, but I knew something was there, watching, waiting. I grabbed my phone and dialed Amanda's number, desperate to hear a familiar voice. She picked up after a few rings. Claire? It's late. What's wrong? I hesitated, unsure of what to say. I, I don't know. I think I'm losing it. Her tone softened, concern replacing her initial grogginess. You're not losing it. What's going on? There's something following me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I can't explain it, but it feels real. And it's getting closer. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Amanda said, You're not crazy, Claire. I felt it too, in my own way. Those moments when you're at your lowest, when you're doubting yourself, that's when it strikes. It feeds on your fear. I sank into a chair, tears stinging my eyes. What do I do? How do I fight it? Pray, she said simply. Even if you don't know what to say, just start. Open yourself to God. He's stronger than whatever's chasing you. I wanted to scoff, to argue that prayer had never done anything for me, but the words wouldn't come. I was too tired, too scared, and too desperate to resist. Okay, I said. I'll try. After we hung up, I sat in the darkened kitchen, unsure of where to begin. My mind flashed back to the steward's words. You must take the steps to heal. Slowly, haltingly, I bowed my head and let the words tumble out. God, if you're there, I need help. I don't know what I'm doing, but I can't do it alone. The cold lifted slightly, like a breath of air after being submerged too long. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. The next day at work, I was assigned to a case that shook me to my core. A little girl, barely 6, had been brought in after an asthma attack. Her mother was frantic, clinging to her daughter's hand as the team worked to stabilize her. Watching them, I felt an ache deep in my chest, a painful reminder of Lily. I had to fight the urge to run out of the room, to escape the flood of memories threatening to overwhelm me. Instead, I stayed. I held the mother's hand when the worst of it passed, and I reassured her that her daughter was stable and in good hands. She thanked me through her tears, and for the first time, I didn't brush it off. I stayed with them until the little girl fell asleep, and as I left the room, I felt something shift inside me. A small piece of the guilt I'd carried for so long began to loosen. That night, I dreamed again. The steward was waiting for me, their light softer this time. You are beginning to understand, they said. But the shadows have not given up. They grow stronger with your fear. I wanted to ask how to fight them, but before I could speak, the dream changed. I was back in the ER, standing in front of a patient I didn't recognize. She was young, no older than her 20s, and her eyes were filled with despair. The memory of her face jolted me awake, my heart racing. Who was she? Why had I seen her? The answer came the next day when I walked into the ER and saw her sitting in the waiting room. She looked just as she had in the dream, and the sight of her sent a chill down my spine. She was clutching her arm, her sleeve torn and bloodied. Excuse me, I said, approaching her cautiously. Do you need help? Her eyes flicked to mine, and I saw the same despair from the dream. I, I don't know, she said, her voice trembling. I don't have insurance. I didn't think anyone would help me. I knelt beside her, my chest tightening. It doesn't matter if you have insurance or not. You're here, and we'll take care of you. Her lip quivered, and she nodded, letting me guide her to an exam room. As I patched her up, she began to open up, telling me about the abusive relationship she was trapped in and the hopelessness that had driven her to almost give up. I listened, really listened, and for the first time, I felt like I was doing more than just treating a wound. I was reaching into the darkness she'd been drowning in and offering her way out. When she left, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. The shadows hadn't come that night, but I knew they were still there, waiting for the moment I'd falter. I couldn't stop now. The steward's words echoed in my mind, urging me forward. This was only the beginning. The night after helping the young woman at the ER, I was restless. Sleep came in fits, my dreams fragmented and uneasy. I woke with a start sometime after midnight, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing against me like a weight. The air felt colder than usual, and the sense of being watched had returned. I sat up, listening, my breath shallow. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a faint whisper, too soft to make out, but unmistakable. My pulse raced as I swung my legs out of bed and stood, straining to hear. The whispering grew louder, the words still unintelligible, but filled with a venomous, taunting tone. It felt like it was coming from inside my head, yet it wasn't my voice. My legs trembled as I stepped into the hallway, the shadows seeming to stretch and move as I passed. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The house remained silent, but the oppressive presence lingered, surrounding me like a suffocating fog. I stumbled back into my bedroom and slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I locked it. Dropping to my knees, I pressed my hands together and whispered a prayer, the words clumsy and desperate. "God, please, I don't know what this is, but I need your help. I can't do this alone." The coldness in the room didn't lift immediately, but I felt a small flicker of warmth in my chest, like a spark trying to catch fire. It wasn't much, but it was enough to steady me. I climbed back into bed, my hands still clasped together, and eventually drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The memory of the previous night clung to me like a shadow, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, expecting to see something lurking just out of sight. At the hospital, I was quieter than usual, my coworkers casting me curious glances. I told myself to focus on the patients, to push the fear aside, but it was like trying to hold back a flood with a single sandbag. Late that afternoon, I was assigned to a patient in critical condition, a man in his 70s who had suffered a severe heart attack. His wife stood by his side, clutching his hand and murmuring prayers under her breath. She was frail, her shoulders hunched with age and worry, but her voice was steady, her faith unshaken. Watching her, I felt a pang of longing, a deep ache for the certainty she seemed to carry so easily. I wanted to ask her how she did it, how she held on to her belief so tightly in the face of such pain. But I didn't. Instead, I focused on my job, keeping my movements professional and efficient. When the man stabilized, his wife turned to me, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "God bless you." Her words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Finally, I nodded, forcing a small smile. "I'm just doing my job," I said, but the words felt hollow, even to me. She reached out and squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "Sometimes God uses people in ways they don't even realize," she said, her voice kind but firm. "You might not see it yet, but He has a plan for you." I swallowed hard, her words striking a chord deep inside me. I thought about the steward, about the shadows, about the young woman I'd helped the day before. Was this all part of a plan? Or was I just grasping at straws, trying to make sense of something too big to understand? That night, the dreams returned. I was back in the golden void, the steward's light surrounding me. But this time, the shadows were there too, darker and more menacing than ever. They circled me, their whispers sharp and cruel. "You can't change," they hissed. "You're too broken, too far gone." I turned to the steward, panic rising in my chest. "I can't do this," I said, my voice trembling. "They're right. I've failed too many times." The steward's light flared, pushing the shadows back slightly. "The journey is not easy, Claire," they said, their voice calm but firm. "But you are not alone. The light within you is stronger than the darkness, if you choose to let it shine." "How?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. I don't know how. By facing what you fear most, they replied. By choosing love over guilt, faith over doubt. The shadows surged forward again, their whispers growing louder, drowning out the steward's voice. I woke with a jolt, my heart racing. The room was dark, the faint glow of the streetlights outside casting long shadows on the walls. I felt the cold presence again, stronger than before, and I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I reached for my phone and called Amanda. She answered on the second ring, her voice groggy but alert. Claire, what's wrong? I need help, I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I don't know what to do. The shadows, the dreams, it's all too much. She didn't hesitate. I'll be there in 20 minutes. When she arrived, she didn't waste time with small talk. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her Bible open in front of her. You're fighting a spiritual battle, she said, her tone matter of fact. And you can't win it alone. You need to lean on God, Claire. You need to trust Him. I don't even know how to do that, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. She reached across the table and took my hands in hers. Start with this, she said. Let's pray together. As she began to pray, her voice steady and confident, I felt a warmth begin to spread through the room. It wasn't sudden or overwhelming, but it was there, a quiet, persistent presence that pushed back the cold. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't completely alone. When she finished, she looked at me, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. This isn't going to be easy, she said, but you're stronger than you think, and God is with you, even when you don't feel it. Her words stayed with me long after she left. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't give up. Not now. The battle wasn't over, but I was beginning to understand that I wasn't fighting it alone. The next few days passed in a blur of work and restless nights. I threw myself into my shifts at the hospital, hoping the routine would keep the shadows at bay. But they didn't leave me. They lingered, lurking at the edges of my mind, waiting for the moments when my guard was down. Each night, as I lay in bed, I felt their cold presence press against me, like they were testing my resolve, waiting for me to crack. I started carrying Amanda's Bible with me, even though I wasn't sure how to use it. I didn't know where to start or what passages to read, but it felt like a shield, a small barrier against the darkness. Amanda called regularly, always offering words of encouragement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing ground. The shadows weren't just external. They were inside me too, feeding on my doubts, my regrets, my fears. It all came to a head during one particularly grueling shift. A man had come into the ER after collapsing at home, his wife sobbing uncontrollably as we worked to stabilize him. I was focused, doing everything I could to help, but something about the situation gnawed at me. His wife's cries reminded me of Lily's last moments, of my own helplessness as I watched my daughter slip away. The memory hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a split second, my hands froze. Claire, are you okay? One of the nurses asked, snapping me back to the present. I'm fine, I said quickly, forcing myself to move again. But I wasn't fine. My chest felt tight, my vision blurred, and the room seemed to tilt. I finished the task mechanically, my body on autopilot, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. When the shift finally ended, I barely made it to my car before breaking down. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel as sobs racked my body. The memories I'd been avoiding for so long were crashing over me, relentless and unforgiving. I saw Lily's face, pale and still, her small body hooked up to machines that couldn't save her. I heard my own voice screaming at God, demanding answers that never came. And behind it all, I felt the shadows, whispering their cruel truths. You failed her. You let her die. You're not worthy of forgiveness. I clenched my eyes shut, trying to block them out, but their voices only grew louder. Stop, I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty car. But they didn't stop. They never stopped. I was suffocating under the weight of their words, their accusations. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. In my desperation, I reached for the Bible on the passenger seat. My hands shook as I opened it, the pages blurring before my eyes. I had no idea what I was looking for, but I clung to it like a lifeline, my fingers skimming over the thin paper. Finally, my eyes landed on a verse, the words jumping out at me as if they'd been written just for this moment. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. I read the verse over and over, the words sinking into me like a balm on an open wound. I didn't feel the shadows leave, but I felt something shift inside me, a flicker of hope, faint but real. I whispered a prayer, my voice trembling. God, I don't know if you're listening. I don't even know if I deserve to ask, but I need you. Please help me. The air in the car seemed to change, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was enough to steady me. I wiped my tears, took a deep breath, and drove home, clutching the Bible like a lifeline. That night, the dream was different. I was back in the golden void, but this time, the shadows were closer than ever. They swirled around me, their whispers louder and more insistent. You can't escape us, they hissed. You're ours. I turned to the steward, their light dimmer than before. I can't do this, I said, my voice breaking. They're too strong. They're strong because you give them power, the steward replied. They feed on your fear, your guilt, but they cannot hold you unless you let them. How do I stop them? I asked, desperation in my voice. By facing the truth, they said. By forgiving yourself and accepting the love that has always been with you. The shadows surged forward, their voices rising to a deafening roar. I fell to my knees, clutching my ears, but the steward's light flared, pushing them back slightly. You must choose, Claire, they said. Faith or fear, light or darkness. The words echoed in my mind as I woke, my heart pounding. The room was dark, but the oppressive presence was gone. I sat up, the steward's words replaying over and over. Faith or fear, light or darkness. I didn't know how to make that choice, but I knew I couldn't keep running from it. The next day, I called Amanda and told her everything, the shadows, the dreams, the whispers. She listened quietly, her voice calm when she finally spoke. You're fighting a spiritual battle, Claire, and the only way to win is to surrender, to let go of the guilt, the fear, and trust that God has already won it for you. Her words stayed with me as I went through the day, their weight sinking deeper with every passing hour. That night, as I lay in bed, I closed my eyes and whispered the same prayer I'd said in the car. God, I need you. I can't do this alone. The air around me felt warmer, the shadows retreating into the corners. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a start. And for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't fighting alone. The day started like any other. I went to work, handled my cases, and tried to keep my focus. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew something was coming. It wasn't the usual sense of dread I'd felt in the days before. It was quieter, more patient. A part of me was tired of running, tired of holding on to the fear and guilt that had defined my life since Lily's death. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. That evening, after my shift ended, I decided to take a drive instead of heading straight home. The weather was calm, the sunset casting a golden glow over the horizon. I had meant to end up at the cemetery, but my car seemed to take me there on its own. The wrought iron gate loomed ahead, and as I parked just outside, my chest tightened. I hadn't been here in years, not since the day we buried Lily. I told myself it was because I couldn't bear the pain, but deep down, I knew it was because I felt unworthy to stand there. What kind of mother lets her child die and then seeks comfort from the grave? The walk to her headstone felt like crossing a battlefield. Every step unearthed memories I'd buried, so deep I thought they couldn't hurt me anymore. The way she used to laugh, the sound of her little feet running through the house, the weight of her small body as I held her during her last moments. By the time I reached her grave, my legs felt like lead, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I knelt beside the stone, tracing the letters of her name with trembling fingers. Hi, Lily, I whispered, my voice breaking. It's been a while. I'm sorry for that. Tears blurred my vision, spilling onto the grass as I spoke. I don't know if you can hear me, but I hope you can. I've missed you so much. Every day I think about you. Every day I wonder if there was something I could have done to save you. And every day I hate myself a little more for failing you. The words spilled out, years of pent up pain and guilt pouring from me like a dam breaking. I told her everything about the shadows, the steward, the moments I'd been too afraid to confront. I've been so angry, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. At God, at myself, at the world, but mostly at God. I didn't understand how he could take you away from me. I still don't, but I'm trying. I'm trying to let go of the anger, to trust that maybe there's something bigger than all of this. As I spoke, a strange sensation came over me, a warmth spreading through my chest, soft but undeniable. It was the same feeling I'd had when Amanda prayed with me, but stronger this time, more present. The shadows weren't there. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely free of their suffocating presence. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth wash over me. In the stillness, I heard a voice, not the steward's, but something softer, more familiar. You didn't fail me, Mom. My breath caught, and I opened my eyes, searching for the source of the voice. The graveyard was empty, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But the voice echoed in my heart, clear and certain. You gave me everything. You loved me, and it's okay to let go. I broke down, sobbing into my hands as the weight I'd carried for so long finally lifted. The guilt, the anger, the fear, it didn't vanish completely, but it no longer controlled me. In its place was something I hadn't felt in years: peace. I stayed at the cemetery for a long time, talking to Lily, praying, and sitting in the quiet. When I finally left, the sky was dark, the stars shining brightly above. As I drove home, I felt lighter than I had in years, like a piece of my soul had been restored. That night, I dreamt of the golden void again. The steward was there, their light brighter than ever. You have taken the first steps, they said, their voice filled with warmth. But the journey is not over. The fractures in your soul are mending, but there is more work to be done. I nodded, their words filling me with a strange sense of determination. I want to keep going, I said. I don't want to live in fear anymore. The steward extended a hand, their light enveloping me. Then walk in faith, Claire. Face the shadows with a light inside you, and you will find the peace you seek. When I woke the next morning, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The shadows hadn't disappeared completely. I could still feel them at the edges of my mind, but they no longer held the same power over me. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to walk it. Over the next few weeks, I began reaching out to the people I'd hurt or ignored during my darkest moments. I visited my estranged sister and apologized for pushing her away. We sat in her living room for hours, talking about everything we'd avoided for years. She forgave me without hesitation, her love and grace humbling me in ways I couldn't put into words. At work, I started seeing my patients differently, not as tasks to be completed, but as people with stories and struggles of their own. I spent more time listening, offering comfort, and being present in ways I hadn't allowed myself to before. Each small act of kindness felt like a step toward healing, not just for them, but for me as well. One evening, as I sat in my living room with Amanda, I told her about the warmth I'd felt at the cemetery, the voice that had spoken to me. She smiled, her eyes shining. That was God, she said. He's been with you this whole time, Claire, even when you couldn't see it. Her words stayed with me as I continued to rebuild my life. The shadows still appeared from time to time, their whispers faint but persistent. But I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I had learned that their power came from my own fear, and as I chose faith over fear, their hold on me weakened. One night, as I prayed before bed, I felt a presence beside me, a warmth that filled the room. It wasn't a steward this time, but something even greater, a love so overwhelming it brought tears to my eyes. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. I had never been alone, and I never would be again.